Hey everyone and welcome. We're here with Mike Smith. You can all say hello before we get cracking on. Some familiar faces.
Hello.
Hello everyone. Hello Mike.
Hello. Hi there.
You're good. I think we're all in and ready. Meet your mics. Yeah. So welcome. Thanks for joining us, Mike. I don't know if you know much about us, but we've been around for nearly 14 years now as a Facebook Blur fan club. And yeah, just in the spirit of the old fan club that Martin Hayward used to run, he is involved in this as well. And
was that the Blurb one?
Blurb, yeah. So that ended about 2006, and we all kind of missed each other. And it was like a case of, well, let's start this up again, like at least on Facebook, and we could do it and all get together. And so we're all here, and we've kept in touch over all the years and become a real kind of community. I think we really look out for each other and like enjoy each other's company. So
that's fantastic. That's really good.
Yeah. Well, Mike, so tell us about, because I guess let's get the first question in, and tell us about your ventures with Downtown. Now let's start with the present and what you're doing there and what you're planning to, who you're planning to bring in.
Well, at the moment, I'm looking after Downtown Music. Downtown's an interesting business. It's a music publishing company. It's also a music service company. So we do a lot of label services. So essentially, you know, I see it as being about the, you know, what I would consider to be the future of the music industry, which is much more about, you know, the service of people's copyrights, which sounds horribly technical and not very musical, but, you know, every time a record is made, every time a song is written, it becomes a copyright. And these have become increasingly commodified and traded. And I think we want to try and get back to a place where the songwriter and the musician is in charge. And it's definitely a big part of my vision at Downtown to, you know, not make it about owning copyrights anymore, but about making it about the songwriter and the artist being in control of their future. Because what's apparent in an age of streaming is that whoever actually owns the copyrights is the one who's making the most money. And I want the artist to own that copyright. You know, I don't see why it should be in the hands of big business. And I think the more that we can do that, the more artists will be able to fund, you know, basically build a sustainable business for themselves and a career for themselves, not feel the pressure to be global superstars on the first record so they can evolve and grow their careers. And I hope have sustainable careers that run into the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. You know, that I remember when I started in the business, you know, I never expected that you'd ever see anything like the Beatles and the Stones again. And maybe we haven't, but I remember people saying, well, that'll never happen again because you don't have that kind of narrowness of media that they had. There were only a few outlets that you had. But I think certainly for a generation growing up on pop music in the 90s, you definitely had that level of fervor there. But you know, what I hope is that we can get to a place where it isn't all about superstars, because, you know, the business of being a superstar is very, very tough. And for me, I want to make a world for musicians and songwriters where, you know, they're not, you know, going through mental collapse after album number 2 because the pressures on them are just enormous. And the more we can just make it about the music, make it about the art, so you don't have to sell as many records, you don't have to stream as many records to make the same amount of money. That, to me, seems a very sensible place to be. So they're lofty ambitions, but I think at my stage in life, it's good to have something very positive to aim for.
Yeah, I agree, especially all that you've been through and where you started to then like presidential positions, etc. I think your head is in the music and looking after musicians, and yeah, that's brilliant stuff. It's great to hear, because I think that's important now, especially with, like you said, how the music industry is going. And
Yeah.
And actually, Hugo, I think he'll pop in probably a little bit later, but he has a very good question about that as well, so he'll get to ask you.
Right. It's interesting because I think music has always been an incredible force for change, and Blur, and in particular Damon, both with Blur but also with Gorillaz, has enacted a lot of very, very positive change. And I think that's another thing that I'm very keen, as I'm still hanging around in the business, what do and you're thinking, well, what else is there to do?
Yeah.
Discovering another superstar, well, that's great, but you feel that you need to serve a little bit more than that. So there are so many issues that the world is facing, be it racial justice, be it gender equality, but also, I mean, for me, the climate and the environment is the number one priority, and being able to enable musicians and songwriters to get involved in that is also very important to me, and something I hope to driving forward in my new position.
Yeah, sounds exciting. Sounds like you can really get into that. Yeah. We have a question here from Maurice. Maurice, do you want to also ask your silly question before the serious question? Because I liked the silly question.
There's no such thing as a silly question.
You wait for it. Can you unmute yourself, Maurice? You're right.
Sorry. Yes. Hi, Mike.
Hi,
thank you for coming.
Pleasure to be asked. Thank you.
Yeah. So he wants me to ask the silly question, so I'll go for it. Do you ever receive emails intended for the other Mike Smith? The fifth member of Blur.
I receive emails. I receive texts. I receive phone calls. Yeah, I mean, certainly, I'm amazed the amount of times I've had a kind of call from management or whatever. And certainly checking into hotel rooms can be quite difficult, where we'll inadvertently check in as each other. So it does happen. Luckily, nothing terribly damaging has ever happened because of it.
Are you aware that the other Mike Smith does too? He does receive mails intended for you?
No, I did not know that.
He told us. We had a chat with him and he told us. It happens.
I better have a word with him. I don't know if they're as innocent as the ones I get that are intended for him.
Yeah, much more serious ones, I would have thought. So yeah, you've
I hope
got a stamp on that.
Yeah, got that.
Okay, now the serious question. When you received the Sir George Martin Award in November 2016, you said that being an A&R man is the best job in the world. Can you explain what your job consists in, how you go about it, and why you like it so much?
When I was a teenager, I used to listen to Top of the Pops every week. I'd watch it on TV, listen to the top 40 countdown. I mean, really from about the age of 9. And I'd always be playing a game of sort of like what, the music that I loved. And there wasn't always a lot that I really loved that was in the charts, but there would always be things there that I really liked. And I'd be watching them and seeing how they'd rise up the charts or whether they'd go down. And then I'd usually record. We used to be able, you could get a C90 cassette those days. There would be 90 minutes that you could record onto a cassette. So I used to record off the radio and record all my favorite songs from the charts and put it on the cassette. And the idea, I guess, took root then, that wouldn't it be great to do a job where I could encourage and nurture the music that I really loved and do everything I could to get it into the charts instead of the music that I didn't like. And I know that's a horribly arrogant and subjective point of view, but hey, I was 14 years old. But to be honest, at the end of the day, I've always gone out and tried to sign music that I loved, that I could imagine on the radio and being in the charts. And, I go out and I search for that music, and my friends in the business tell me about it. Musicians, I think, are brilliant at telling you about, the most exciting new music. I love radio, and I still hear a lot of new music on the radio. I still pick up a lot from reading, blogs, the few music magazines that are still left out there, I'm fascinated by. I talk to a lot of managers and lawyers and other A&R people. A&R has given me such an incredible life. I'm quite a shy person, or certainly was when I was younger. And it really forced me to sort of like go out into the world and meet people and do, if you choose, you can't be a shrinking violet if you're an A&R person. You've got to go out, you've got to find the music. It's funny, so many people ask me, well, how do I get into A&R? And it's sort of like, well, if you haven't figured that out, how are you going to find the best new band in Scotland? How are you going to find anything out if you haven't worked out how you can even get to the business? And that, I know that sounds quite tough, and I didn't have the faintest idea, but I just had a stab at it and threw myself at it and just kept on throwing myself at it until I got in. And that's sort of what you have to do. Either that or, be reasonably well off and your dad knows somebody in the music business, which seems to work much, much better. But hey, I'd like to think it's getting better now. And what is my job entails? It's exactly the same as it always has done. Listening to music, usually the music that my team are sending to me and presenting to me, and seeing what I like and seeing if I can imagine it getting on New Music Friday or played on the radio and getting into the charts. And if I like it and I can imagine it doing all those things, then we should try and sign it. I trust my taste, after 35 years of doing this, I trust my taste.
It does sound like the best job in the world.
Yeah. You meet so many A&R people and they're absolutely bloody miserable because, they haven't got great bosses and there's so much intense pressure on them. And that always, it's such a terrible shame, and if they had better bosses, their bosses would be saying, sign that, don't sign that, sign that, don't sign that, and just guiding them. I was blessed with incredible bosses, and it stopped me from signing rubbish. So the acts that I did sign, and bizarrely, Blur were the first band I signed. It was downhill all the way after that. But that was because I had bosses that were really hard on me and were just like, this isn't good enough. I offered on a couple of things before. I tried to sign a band called Ride, and I tried to sign a singer-songwriter called Tasmin Archer. And I was only working for a small publishing company at the time, and I got beaten out both times by other companies. But the relationship that I struck up with Blur was sufficiently strong that they came with me for much less money than they were offered by our competitors. So the universe certainly conspired to make it happen, it felt like.
Definitely sounds like that age-old do a job you'll love and you never work a day in your life.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah. God knows it's unspeakably hard at times, and the pressure's off the scale. And I've had some pretty tough people I've had to work for, and especially as you get higher up the greasy pole. But the ups are equally brilliant when you get higher. you're in a position to really affect change. You know, you're the one going in saying, we signed this, and guess what? We're going to break it. And I think when I got to run a major label, I really believed that if you put the kind of money I saw other people putting behind pop acts that I didn't particularly like, I thought if we can put that behind acts like MGMT or The Gossip, we could do incredible stuff. And we did. And that was great to do. You know, we got some genuinely left field music out there into the world, and, you know, getting bands like Sleigh Bells on, you know, the daytime Radio 1 A list was great. I thought, you know, that's what it was all about for me.
Yeah, those little wins. That
Yeah.
sounds brilliant. Yeah. Thanks, Maurice. We have a question next from Peter. Peter, have you got your, if you can, yeah, Sleigh Bells are great. Yeah. Aidan just said. Yeah, Peter.
Hi, hi, Mike. Pleased to meet you.
Good to meet you.
I was going to ask you, when you signed Blur, did you have any doubts about them when you signed them?
You know, it's funny. The first time I went to see them at the Bull and Gate, and I didn't know much about them at all. I worried that it was a little bit too contrived, that Food Records were being a bit too heavy-handed, because Andy Ross, their A&R guy, was by the side of the stage, and I mean, as Andy always is, he was right down the front, you know, head in his, you know, holding his chin and concentrating furiously, and, you know, as things would fall over, or because those early gigs very chaotic, Andy would be like fixing things out, and they were all wearing, you know, the latest baggy t-shirts. They all had bowl cut haircuts, and I thought, is this just a bit contrived? And there was an element of thinking, hang on, this is trying too hard to jump on the bandwagon. And it was only when I went back the following week that every single song stayed with me from the previous week, and I was just blown away by how strong the melodies were, how hooky the bass and the guitar parts were. I mean, they're really, you know, I mean, Alex in particular, I don't think gets enough respect as a musician. He's one of the greatest bass players.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant bass player.
Yeah, and you just, because he's not, you know, most bass players are sort of like sticking closely to the beat. He's using a bass almost as a lead instrument, you know, and I guess he was inspired by, you know, the, you know, be it Bernard Edwards or Peter Hook who did that, you know, that, but what a great combination. Bernard Edwards and Peter Hook in an indie guitar band. You know, that's not what you sort of like expect. And yeah, the second time I saw them, I was in 100% and never lost that. Yeah, I just always been 100% loyal. I mean, you know, through thick and thin and through feast and famine, you know, they weren't always firing on all cylinders, but I always believed in them.
Excellent.
And then Gorillaz and then Damon later on, you stuck by and
yeah, I mean, again, you know, Damon was getting a lot of stick, as you can imagine, you know, somebody who'd made such an impression in a, you know, a very British white guitar band, suddenly trying to launch a hip hop project with global music leanings. You know, a lot of people didn't take it seriously at all. And from my point of view, I mean, I've got to be honest, there was virtually no music to listen to when we did the deal with Gorillaz. It was just having faith in Damon and having faith in Jamie Hewlett, who I believed in just as much as I believed in Damon. I think they're both brilliant original thinkers. I'd known Jamie nearly as long as I'd known the band, as long as I'd known the lads in Blur. I was a huge fan of Deadline and of Tank Girl, and I was, you know, I got to meet him because he was good friends with the band. He'd been at art school with Graham's girlfriend, I think it was. So I remember them taking me down. I think I went down with Graham to a deadline signing and got to meet Jamie. And for me, it was like, you know, meeting a real pop star. And guess what? You know, he was lovely, really, really brilliant bloke. And, you know, he drew a picture of me, I drew a picture of him, you know, and we've stayed friends ever since. He's a wonderful guy. And he sort of, I think the combination of Jamie and Damon is incredible because they are very different personalities and they work really, really well together.
Yeah, I think you got to see that in the Bananas documentary,
Yeah.
I think, with Gorillaz. That was
Yeah.
really cool to see that dynamic.
Yeah, because I mean, you know, Jamie isn't, you know, Jamie's certainly no saint, but he can be quite laid back in a way that Damon can be quite intense at times. And that doesn't mean that, you know, Jamie can't be very intense as well. But I feel, you know, there's a great yin and yang between the two, and it works well, especially in interviews. So it's good to have the two of them together.
Yeah, definitely. We have a question from Tom.
Hi, Mike.
Hello, Tom. How you doing?
Yeah, very good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not bad at all.
Awesome. You kind of touched upon this with Peter's question but I was just wondering if you've got any memories from your first impressions of the guys, meeting them, and then the live gigs that you just mentioned. But have you any?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. It is like it only happened yesterday, and it was, God, what was it now? I mean, it was 1990 when I first met them, and when I saw, I was really struck at that second gig. It's just like, wow, these guys are you know, really striking looking band. You know, Damon had, you know, there's a film called Children of the Damned. I don't know if you know it, but it's about these, you know, blonde, blue-eyed kids that are almost are very scary. And Damon just looked like one of them. There was just something otherworldly. I mean, to be honest, there was something otherworldly about all of them. I mean, particularly Damon and especially Alex, mainly because he was incredibly stoned in the early days. He was smoking quite a lot of dope, so he always had a big smile on his face. And you know, I couldn't quite work it out. You know, he would walk around with a cricket bat for effect, and I couldn't work out if he was, you know, trying to do he was like a character in an Evelyn Waugh novel, you know, and you sort of like had him on one side, and then Graham, who was a bit more shy, but on a musical level was very easy to connect with because he and I both had an enormous fondness for the, you know, the American and the British indie scene. Yeah. But then Damon and I, you know, really liked Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht, and I loved the theatrical side of them. I mean, that was a massive part for me. You know, the Alex and Graham had been to Goldsmiths, and Damon was at Stratford East doing drama. You know, I'm probably my favorite musicians have been to art school, and it's, you know, I think art school is such an amazing education. You know, imagine being taught how to be creative, how to think creative. You know, whatever your chosen career is in life, or what. I mean, I couldn't be more passionate about wanting art to be, you know, a compulsory subject at school. It never will be, because unfortunately, pretty much every government, certainly every conservative government, seems to regard art as light entertainment, not as the absolute, you know, foundation of what humanity is. You know, they just see it as something, you know, that makes you laugh at the end of the pier, something to pass the time, you know, whereas, you know, if you think creatively, you know, that's why Steve Jobs was such an incredible success. He thought creatively. And I think, you know, business leaders who think creatively are the ones that make incredible progress. Engineers who think creatively, physicists who think creatively. You know, Einstein, clearly incredibly creative brain. So the fact that they've been to art school really excited me. The fact that Damon had this whole kind of like theater of cruelty element going on. They were just operating at a different intellectual level to any other band out there. And they were also writing great songs. And very punk rock, but strange and weird. And, I remember, I think that they played a gig at the venue in New Cross. It might have been supporting Pulp, I'm not sure. And that would have been in the spring of 1990. And I just remember when they played She Is So High, just thinking, because that guitar part is so strong. It's very, it reminds me a lot of the Byrds, 60s band, the Byrds, but it also obviously reminds me of Stone Roses, who were also very, very influenced by the Byrds. And the fact that the Stone Roses had such success, that I think at that time, their first album had come out 6 months before, it had been a platinum record. I mean, they were big, but we didn't quite know how big and how important they were going to be. And I thought, you know what? I reckon this band, Blur, could be as big as the Stone Roses. And that's, that was as good as it could possibly get. Because when I started in the business in the 1980s, if you liked guitar music, you had the Smiths, but, to be honest, the Smiths didn't sell a huge amount of records. You only really had REM as a band to look to and go, that's the music that I love. And, they've managed to go on, sell millions of records and not turn into assholes. So that's it. That's the blueprint. If I can only find my REM, I can do my job. And the Stone Roses came along and they proved that you could make very uncompromising music with staggeringly brilliant, very politicized lyrics and be successful, And I thought, well, if a band like the Stone Roses can be successful, a band like Blur can be successful, and maybe I'll be able to keep doing my job.
Well,
cheers, Tom. We've got Aidan with the next question.
Hi, Mike.
Hello, Aidan. How you doing?
Not too bad. My question is a non-Blur related one, if that's all right. I wanted to ask you about the Avalanches. So just I'm reading this so I don't mess it up. So with a 16-year gap between the first and second album from the band, did this present difficulties from your end?
Well, I mean, to be honest, whilst the Avalanches were following up the first album, I probably moved jobs about 5 times. And because I'm trying to think, when I would have signed them, it was probably towards the, actually, I'm going to say the beginning. You probably got a better idea of when the album came out than I did, when the first album came out.
2000.
It was 2000, yeah. It was 90s, early noughties. So it you know what, I haven't really got a problem. If somebody takes time doing a follow-up record, obviously from a business point of view, it's terrible, because people usually say, well, that first Avalanches record sold 500,000 copies. When are we going to get another 500,000 selling Avalanches record? Oh, I think we're going to get it in September. So somebody writes it into a ledger somewhere that we're going to get it in September. And then it doesn't come, and you're 500,000 records worse off than you should be. In publishing, it's actually worse because publishing deals only last for 3 years. So you pick up, the band do the first record, we pick up the option. And from the moment we pick up that option, we have 3 years before they hit what's called an ultimate date. And when they hit that ultimate date, you've got to make a decision about whether you exercise the option for the next record and keep going, whether you double down really, or whether you say, you know what, there ain't going to be another Avalanches record. And I think, you know, the album came out into, I think we were able to negotiate an extension with the band. So, you know, they were understanding. But I'd left EMI by 2005. And in the end, I think they were let go. Well, I think the deal just ran out at EMI.
Wow.
But interestingly, by the time, because I was good friends with the management, and I think I was working for Virgin Records when the second album came out, and I remember Nick Dewey, their manager, who's now married to Emily Evis, he played the tracks. I think it was Frank Sinatra, the track on the train to me, and it was just sort of like, it's just so good to have it back. It's just so good.
Yeah, it was. I didn't think it was ever going to happen.
No, I wish. I mean, there's this. Like I said, you know, is it a problem? You know, it's a business problem, definitely. But they're back, and they seem to be regularly putting out music again, so that's great. You know, My Bloody Valentine, I think, probably took even longer. But
that was 20. Oh, how many years was that?
Yeah,
it was nearly. I think it was nearly 20 years. I think, or something like that.
But the great thing with My Bloody Valentine is that MBV, the album they actually finally put out, was a great record. Was it as great as Loveless? You know, probably not. But, you know, it didn't matter. You know, it's very difficult to sort of like grade music, I think. You know, obviously it is a competition because we have a top 40, a Billboard top 200. But, you know, you could probably say, well, you know, Loveless is the best My Bloody Valentine record, then isn't anything maybe number 2, MB3 number 3. But it doesn't matter because it's just like the music's out there. And I'm delighted to have them back. I'm delighted they're touring. I mean, I think if you're a passionate fan of a band, as I obviously all of you are of Blur, it's very, very frustrating when they're seemingly not around and you want to hear more music. But, you know, I think there's always ways to sort of like dig deep into, you know, the catalog, find things you've not heard before, find out more about the individuals. I mean, I think, you know, music for me is a never-ending quest. And I think, you know, with a band like Blur, you can just be exploring their influences and their roots and going off in every single different direction and finding out what they're all up to now. And there's so much music there. And you know, I'm a big believer that artists, you know, should put music out as often as they possibly can. But, you know, I'm not going to give them a hard time if they don't put a record out, you know.
And My Bloody Valentine were a big influence on Blur as well back in the day, weren't they?
Who was that?
My Bloody Valentine were a big influence on Blur back in the day, weren't
they? Yeah. I mean, you think of things like Day Upon Day or Won't Do It with that.
Oily Water as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's that kind of almost like feeling of vertigo and the crescendo of noise building and building, building and building. And they were all friends, you know, they all hung out, you know, we went to the same parties together and certainly drank together. And I think it probably helped that Leo Silverman, who was one of the first music journalists, in fact, the first music journalist to write about Blur, was Irish and was very good friends with My Bloody Valentine. And, you know, Blur at the beginning were not seen as being particularly cool. And because they were on Food and Food had Jesus Jones. And I think Leo's connection with, you know, My Bloody Valentine and my connection with a lot of the Creation artists helped sort of like position Blur in a slightly different place. You know, it would have been easy for them to sort of like go down a much more pop route and argue that, you know, they touched on that many, many times. But to me, you know, I was always one to accentuate the more art school side of themselves as much as the kind of pure pop side.
Yeah.
You know, Sing, I thought was a masterpiece. You know, I was blown away when they recorded that as the B-side on the first single.
Absolutely.
With,
Thanks very much, Mike.
with
Thanks,
that
mate.
in mind, what kind of, how do you see the pressures on the artist as to release music? Like, how much pressure would you put on someone if they're a big success? Do you want them to then churn something out as quickly as possible, or would you say we'll give you time to create another masterpiece, as it were, or whatever it was to make that money? How do you kind of balance that?
Obviously, from a professional point of view, you want
Mm.
to get a record out. But I don't think there is anything to be served by, you know, no one, if the artist is any good, no one is the harshest critic, and no one is more aware of the situation they are in than the artists themselves. You know, the artist knows they haven't put a record out. And the reason they haven't put a record out is probably because they're sitting there going, if they're any good, they're sitting there going, you know, the music that I'm making, is it as strong as what I did before? You know, the music I'm making is a very different sideways approach to what I was making before. Will anybody like it? And maybe they played it to their A&R guy, and the A&R man's gone, or woman's gone, there's no hits here, there's no singles. So they have to go away and work on it again. Obviously, I mean, Blur went through that a lot with the making of Modern Life is Rubbish. You know, there was a moment when it felt like there was real momentum coming off the back of the first album. The first album had done okay, but its thunder had been taken away probably by Screamadelica in 1991 when that record came out.
It's
And,
behind you. Okay, I can see it there behind you.
oh yeah, sorry, yeah. And I remember meeting Andy Weatherall back then, and I think he saw I was wearing a Blur badge, and he said, "Oh, do you like Blur?" Then I went, "Yeah, I do. I work with them. What do you think of them?" And he was just a bit, "Nah, they don't really do it for me. A bit too commercial." And I remember John Peel was the same, and he was just like, "Yeah, a little bit too much melody." Well, I mean, you've probably seen the Star-Shaped video where he, you know, if they could expunge the melody, they'd be a bit better. And I think that those all add up to reasons why artists are scared to put music out. And that's why, you know what, from my point of view, I would just, you know, if you've got music and you feel happy to stand behind it, put it out and be judged. And don't, I mean, you could argue that if you know, you take that approach, we might not have got For Tomorrow and Chemical World, which were very much the result of the record label going in and going, we're not going to put anything out until you write a proper single. But I mean, I have to say, even without those two records, I think Modern Life is Rubbish is a damn good, well, it's an incredible record. But I have to say, you know, Modern Life, For Tomorrow was a quantum leap forward in Damon's songwriting. And I remember I had a friend of mine down, and we went to see them perform at Finsbury Park, and it was the first time I think they played For Tomorrow live, and it was just an acoustic thing. Damon and Graham did it, and my friend, who was like a school friend of mine from Merseyside, he just went to me and went, "Oh my God, I think you might actually have something special here." And it was, to me, that I think For Tomorrow was the first thing they did that was really special. And I love all of the Seymour stuff, I love Leisure, love all the early stuff. I mean, in many ways, it's some of my favorite Blur material. But in terms of something that felt like could touch the hearts of the world, that was probably the first song that really did that.
Yeah, that's great. This is fascinating stuff. I think it's brilliant. We've got a yeah, and a lot of the early stuff, like people, I mean, they'll all say it right now. They absolutely love it, so they're on board with you there. We've got a question from Hugo. So the question I thought kind of fitted in with what you said earlier. Hugo.
Hi, Mike.
Hi, Hugo.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm very good. You keeping well?
I'm trying to. Well, I was looking for the question that I sent to Ian. It really is just if you have any comment on the recent news of some artists wanting to take all the writers' royalties. I don't know if this is happening with any of your artists, but a few have talked about it.
Is this you know, a lot of high-profile artists, including Damon, approaching the prime minister or approaching the government to ask if they can get better royalties as songwriters from the digital platforms? Is it that you're referring to?
No, it's the songwriters that write songs to top performers, and those performers want their publishing royalties.
Of course, yeah. Do I have an opinion on it? Yeah,
Yeah,
of course I do. It's unfortunately a practice that's gone on throughout the music industry, and it's a practice I don't particularly approve of. But it's always been that way. If you wanted to get Elvis Presley to cover one of your songs, Elvis Presley you'd have to give that song to Elvis Presley's publishing company. And you know, likewise, you know, if you want to write, if you want to get into the room and write with some big superstars, they will take a piece of the publishing, as you know, because they've been so gracious to allow you to write a song with them. And at the end of the day, you know, I think, you know, it's a tough thing to say, because obviously you go into the room and write a song for a superstar, and because of that superstar's power and track record, that song becomes a hit. Suddenly you're the hottest songwriter out there. And that makes suddenly the fact that every artist suddenly wants to work with you. So the fact that you've only got 50% of the song that you actually probably wrote most of it for, you know, you can forget about that because suddenly you're working with everybody else. But I think it's wrong. I think we should get back to the truth of the situation. You know, I don't understand why a super rich, when it usually is a super rich artist, feels the need to take songwriting credit from an up and coming songwriter. You know, they should be much more proud to say, I helped discover this writer. And, you know, I'm delighted, you know, they've introduced me to a whole new sound, and, you know, it's great. And I feel really privileged to be able to collaborate with this new kid that's helping me to transform their music. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. And it's one of the many, I don't know, one of the many iniquities of the music industry that's been allowed to go on, because the bigger picture means, you know, I think people just go, well, that's the way it is. But it shouldn't be the way it is. And I sincerely hope there's a new generation of songwriters coming through that's going, you know what, fuck this. You know, fair enough. I won't write for that superstar. You know, I believe enough in my songwriting is that I'll go and do it my own way. But I think it gets difficult often when, like, you'll have a songwriter there, and maybe that songwriter's publisher and the songwriter's manager is going, look, I don't care. We'll take, and I've done it myself. And I've said in the past, you know, we'll just take 50%. I know you wrote all of the song, but just take 50%, because 50% of a song by that superstar is going to be, you know, will probably pay off all your advance. And won't that be great? But at the end of the day, let's call it out for what it is. It's straight theft. You know, if that artist did not write on that song, but they are taking a publishing credit, they may as well be walking around to that songwriter's house and stealing the television set and taking it home. You know, that's what it is, straight theft.
So at being the global president of Downtown, that this is something you're going to address and look to change, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we have, myself and Justin Kalifowitz, who's my boss, have gone into print and made our opinions. You know, we completely back the songwriters that are calling for change in this area. I think you just got to shame those people that do it. You just got to call it out. But these people are so damn powerful. Everyone's scared of calling anyone out. And I think that's one of the nice things about working for an independent company now. Because I can, you know, I don't feel I don't feel beholden to that system.
Yeah.
Just like I've been fortunate enough to work at Sony, at Universal, and at Warner's, but the number of times I'd have people saying, "Oh, you can't say that," or I'd go off and do press, and somebody would be getting alarmed about something I'd said because it might offend another artist. And I hope I'm sufficiently savvy, not to say things that are going to offend, and I don't go out to offend, but I just see this situation as being one of injustice, and it just upsets me that the people profiting from it are people who are very rich. And just because, the very fact that you've got a piece of a superstar's song, if you had to give a piece of the songwriting away when that superstar didn't write that piece that you've given away to them, it just seems wrong. It seems very wrong, even if it does enable that to start your career and that's it. It's a bit like, well, we're not going to pay this work experience person because, just getting the chance to work in our office, that's going to enable them to start their career in the music business. And I was just sort of like, I'm involved with a charity called the Creative Society, this was one of the big things that we were upset about, because the people that can afford to do that are usually people who live in London, and are usually from quite well off homes, and they can afford to work for free because they're living with the mum and dad, and the mum and dad are prepared to look after them. But if you're a kid from Middlesbrough trying to break into the music industry, that working for free model's not going to really not going to fix it so easily. And I definitely, I'm from Birkenhead, and again, there was no notion of being able to live with mum and dad whilst I tried to break into the music industry. You just went in and, threw yourself at it until you could get a wage. So yeah, there's a lot of practices, even in 2021, that are wrong, and we've got to change it. But what I'm excited about is that I see the younger generation being a lot less tolerant of the ways of doing business that have gone on for years.
That's good. Yeah, definitely
good,
speaking up.
Good to see you are on the right side.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Thank you.
It is definitely the right side. Yeah,
it is for sure. We've got a question from David, Mr. Grain.
Hello. Yeah, I've got one very short one and one slightly longer one. So first one, do you play any instruments yourself?
I can play the piano exceptionally badly. I do know my way around a bass guitar. I did used to sing in a band, and one of my great regrets was that once I became a talent scout, I told the lad that I was in the band with, we're not good enough to get signed, let's disband, let's call it quits. And we should have just carried on and played gigs and recorded stuff because it was fun.
What was your band's name?
Well, that band was called Walk on Hands, and luckily there is no surviving trace of it out there in the world. And I used to paint on stage with a band called Mrs. Mills Party, which, if you do explore Mancunian music in the mid-'80s, you may find reference to them. They were like quite a psychedelic kind of like nuggetsy, garagey kind of band. I mean, like all bands that come together, especially at college, you'll have one kid that's into Elvis Costello, you'll have another one that's into the Doors. We had was massively into Lou Reed, and this weird, that's how the band comes together. Oh, and the drummer, Al Macaulay, was a jazzer and went on to play in the Tindersticks, and that was the band. And it's like it. And guess what? I got it because I wasn't musical, but I could paint. So I got up on stage behind them, and I used to paint pictures behind them every night because I wanted to be in a band, but I wasn't musical. So yeah, that's the closest I've got to actually being on stage and being in a band.
Nice. One slightly longer question. Are there any particular characteristics you look for in an artist or bands that you want to work with, or is it kind of gut feel?
If it's somebody I'm going to work with, it's ambition and drive, and it's not necessarily I want to be a superstar ambition. It's just that ambition to I want to make incredible art, which sounds really pretentious, but just somebody who is devoted to their work. And when everything gets really, really tough, and it always gets really, really tough in the music industry, they'll keep working. And I think that that's probably what I look for more than anything. It's almost like everything else is a given. You're not going to be having a conversation with them if they can't write songs. This is me as a publisher speaking. But even, as a record exec, you're not going to be talking to them, if they haven't got, a vocal that's interesting and sound, it's got a degree of commerciality. And to me, drive and determination is the reason why the Spice Girls were huge and plenty of other girl bands weren't huge. I mean, you could argue that maybe it was the great songs that they had as well and the great production that they had, but and you can judge, anyone who knew those girls, it was, they'd take your head off. They were so ambitious. Same with the Spice Girls. And again, for me, meeting Damon was a remarkable experience because he was, like I said, very intense, but also one of the most, driven individuals. And I think he talks about how upset he'd get when he booked a rehearsal space and the rest of the band didn't turn up. And it was just, and he had to go all the way from, I think the rehearsal place was up in King's Cross, and he had to go down to South London and find them, and I was absolutely furious with them. That shit didn't happen. Most bands are pretty sloppy. There's a reason why the Clash are a band that matters. They drilled themselves really, really hard, and the best bands do.
I found it very interesting what you said earlier about creativity. So I work with software engineers on a day-to-day basis, and the best ones I've ever worked with are very, very driven and very, very creative, right? So it doesn't matter what they're building or what industry you work in. Those two combinations in whatever industry you work in can really, really make a big difference in your career. And there's lots of people, that's probably only 20% of the population, maybe 10% of the population have that combination of creativity and drive. But you need those in any organization, whether that's music, software engineering, like I said, in order to drive a great product forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so true. And one of the problems, and it's a problem in society, is that everybody thinks, well, how do I learn how to get this drive? Or how do I learn how to be creative?
Just got to do it.
Yeah, you just got to get on and do it, and get up in the morning and do it, and try and trust in yourself. But at the end of the day, it's something. And Alex James, to me, is the absolute pinnacle of this. It's just like the key to success is turning up. And Alex was always out there, and he was a charming guy, is a charming guy. and would always be meeting people. And it was just almost like every single minute of the day, Alex would be meeting people and making the most of the opportunity that he met with that person. And then all of a sudden, you know, if you are hanging out with Damien Hirst, things will happen. And you suddenly, you know, you're making a record with Keith Allen, and it's a football song, and it's #1, you know, and was it, I mean, you could say, well, you know, was Alex really driven? Yes, he was. You know, Alex was out there, and it, you know, it can appear to be like partying 100% of the time. And it wasn't 100% of the time. He always took one day off a week to get, as I think he said in his book, to get the gas bills paid. But it's a bit like me with the way I do my job. You know, I'd go out and see gigs every night, and I did it because I loved it. But the fact that I went out to gigs, usually, you know, most of the gigs I went to see weren't that great, but I always enjoy, you know, I love going to a gig. So I'd always find something there to enjoy. And I'd go to a gig and there'd be other A&R people there and other musicians and other journalists. And that's how I'd find out about stuff. Or somebody would say, oh, can you come along to this party tonight? And it's just like, oh, I've been out every night this week. I can't, I need to go home. I say, oh, well, just come along, just turn up for half an hour. When you turn up for half an hour and you meet some film producer or some TV person, that's pretty much how any of the creative, well, to be honest, that's how any business works. And it's the people that go on and make a difference in the, you know, and the people who go on and advance their careers are the ones that will go out and do those kind of meetings and it might seem easy to go out and go to a party or go to gigs every night, but most people won't be prepared to do that. They want to go home, they want to get a pizza, they want to watch TV. It's pretty tough to keep going at that level. And I certainly look back on my life and question some of those decisions that I made, you know, and I sacrificed time with my family when I was younger. And I always thought, well, you know, I was always there at the weekends, but you know, it's time I'll never get back. And I do think, you know, maybe I worked too hard, but then, and that's the funny thing, because my children, I've got 2 daughters who've grown up, and I've always been very, look, as long as you're happy, I don't mind what you do. And I remember my elder daughter saying, well, that's ridiculous, Dad. You know, you and Mum are 2 of the most driven people we know. You know, you've got your job. My wife's a corporate lawyer, and you know, can you imagine what it's like for us kids? We feel we've got to step up to that plate. And I go, you don't just, and it's just like that, you say don't, but we can't help it. They absorb it. They sort of like see what we've been like, and I'm like this because that's what my mum and dad were like, you know. And they weren't, you know, my dad did the books. He was an accountant for a soap factory, and my mum was a nurse, but they worked really bloody hard. So it was just like there was never any, and I feel sorry, you know, I hate it when people sort of like say, oh, that person's lazy, you know, why can't they work harder? And it's just like, maybe they never had anybody showing them how to work harder when they were younger. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's such a brutal business, the music business. If you're not determined and you're not super ambitious, then you're not going to succeed. And unfortunately, you know, at the end of the day, I need to make money just to keep the lights on, keep everybody happy, keep my bosses happy. So I've got to find people that are going to be able to cope with the pressure, because if they can't, they'll end up being miserable in this business, and they should have gone and done something else. Whereas if you've got the strength of character, you can, you know, you can do amazing things.
Yeah, it
That's
sounds
great,
like,
thank you.
yeah, you're a really good positive influence on your kids. So that, you know, it's great that they gave you that feedback as well. You know, it's important.
I mean, I hope so. Look, they seem to have turned out decent kids, you know, and they really inspire me, because, you know, my eldest daughter's at college and she's studying psychology and philosophy and human behavior. And my younger daughter was thinking of going into the, you know, they both love music, but my younger daughter actually wanted to be in the music business and be an A&R person. And I think she saw how much stress I went through at work, and just went, you know what? I'm not sure about this. So she's, you know, she's a very staunch environmental campaigner. She's going to college to study geography, and she's going to do everything she can to save the planet. So, you know, we haven't got much time, but hopefully she can be part of a generational movement to do good. And I think it, you know, I'm very positive for the future, because I think the banks will figure out there's more money in saving the planet than sending Elon Musk to Mars. So let's spend the money making this a good place to live. Very
true. I'm very conscious of the time. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah, go on. Yeah, no worries.
And Jeff, do you have your question there? It's quite a nice one. Oh, we can't hear you, Jeff. No.
Oh.
Should I ask your question for you? Do you want to? No, okay.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah.
There
you go.
Hi, yes. Hi, Mike. Just
Hello,
a bit. And my ex-wife used, just to touch on a few of the points you made, used to work for Simon Fuller, who shared an office with Chris Morrison in Battersea around the time that Blur and was sort of, you know, were on ramping up. And as you probably know, he was managing Jesus and Mary Chain and Van Morrison at that time. And I remember she brought home a promo copy of Modern Life is Rubbish, and I put it on, and I just thought, fuck, this is just really refreshing. And there was a lot of obviously comparisons made to the Small Faces and et cetera. I thought, yeah, this is really, really great band. And I just wondered, you know, in George Martin's biography, he obviously was a bit, should we say, reticent about the Beatles' talent, and that. And I was listening to you earlier before saying that when you met Damon, etc., that, you know, it was it made a great impression on you. But I think my question was, did you have the same opinion that George Martin did early on about the Beatles? Well, I think you've answered that already. So, yeah, and obviously you had George Martin's award given to you recently, or back in, was it 2016?
Yeah, and I also find myself publishing George Martin is at the estate. I mean, it's not a huge body of work, but it's lovely to be touching him. I mean, I think I was very lucky that, especially growing up in Liverpool, the Beatles were such a massive part of everybody's life up there. So I knew who George Martin was. I knew he was their producer. I also knew he was their A&R person, and he'd been responsible for signing them. So, you know, I knew what an A&R person was. I mean, it's interesting. I wasn't aware that he was in any way dismissive of the Beatles' talent, because I mean,
he was very skeptical early on. I mean, I worked with George for about 4 years. So I've heard a lot of stories about things, you know, without sounding, you know, sycophantic or complacent, about what he thought of them. And it was, there's some interesting stories that he shared with us when we were working with him at Air back in the sort of early 90s.
Well, that's it, because I mean, for me, some of those early rock and roll, you know, the recordings, you know, you listen to the live recordings in Hamburg, and they just sound like one of the most ferocious rock and roll bands that have ever lived. And it's interesting, you know, you then go and listen to like the Beatles at the Beeb, and it's all the same songs, but it feels very sanitized. And I feel the Beatles took a while to really get that energy, you know, that they had in the live side into their own music. And I can understand you know, that George Martin could have thought that Please Please Me was you know, was a perfectly good pop song, but wasn't anything remarkable. But I mean, God, how he could not. Yeah, it's odd to think. I mean, it's very easy with hindsight, but how he could, you know, that chemistry between the four of them was just phenomenal. Yeah, I remember Alex asking me, you know, it wasn't long after we started, and he just like said, "So who's the best band ever then?" And I just said, "It's the Beatles." And I still think it is, when you sort of like look at that level of ambition and what they tried to embrace, and the fact that they were just pumping out music at a colossal speed. And the quality control was so exceptional. I mean, when I love their music from the start to the end of their career. I'm hugely excited at the thought of Get Back coming out, because that looks just sensational.
Yeah.
And I think there's, you know, I mean, the Beatles are a great example of sort of like, you know, and this is a conversation I've had with Alex and Dave, because they're the two members of the band who are most interested in the legacy, I think, of the band. Is that, you know, when I was working in record companies, I'd work with a lot of people who weren't necessarily releasing records anymore, and it's a lot of what I do. I do a lot of catalog work still. And what I find it amazing is that, you know, Universal and Apple know what the Beatles are doing for the next 10 years. And that's what I was saying to Alex and Dave. It's just sort of like, you know, it doesn't matter that you're not putting out new music. God knows I'd love it if there was new music coming out, but there's so much that you could be doing. You know, there's out there on the internet, there is, you know, a Seymour show at the Square in Harlow. Now, why haven't, you know, and there's a video to go with it. Why haven't you grabbed that opportunity, worked on those recordings, worked on that video, and actually turn it into something really special that you could release and, you know, get out to the fans? And there's an endless amount of creative work that's been done that you can keep on going with. You know, I think any interesting band that's making creative stuff, you know, you can keep it alive. But the interesting thing that Blur have is that Damon, who's the main engine for the band, is constantly looking forward. And I think that's a great thing. You know, he's not looking back at all. But and Robert Plant is exactly the same in Led Zeppelin, not remotely interested in Led Zeppelin, always interested in the next collaboration, the next way forward, the next new piece of music. But Led Zeppelin do have Jimmy Page, who tinkers away with the legacy till the end of time.
Indeed. No, two points on that. One thing about the Beatles being the best band ever, I think one thing that I've discovered sort of traveling around the globe is that it's not the Beatles or the Stones that really capture people's imagination. There's one person, if you go globally, that is seen as a revolutionary and a real benchmark. It's Bob Marley.
Yeah. Yep.
He seems to trump everyone.
Yeah. No, and quite right too. You know, and I think he
signifies struggle.
Yeah.
He seems to be at another level above the kind of, you know, the British scene or the Americans. He really captures something, an essence that no one else does.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And you know, it's when you talk about bands in the context of, you know, 4 working class lads from the north or 5 middle class lads from the south, it is a very, very narrow prism, and we should, you know, that ignores the great bands of hip hop, that ignores somebody like Fela Kuti, and it's just very much put through that very, at the end of the day, music journalists are white middle class men. So that's and it's the kind of music that they love that gets the focus. I think, how old was I? I was a fairly naive 23-year-old when Alex asked me that. And the Beatles were such a massive part of my growing up, having grown up in Merseyside. I certainly wouldn't say that now. And I don't think you can play that game. I love a list. I love, if somebody's, got, 100, I love these things, they're not, but things like that, I just live for, because it's just sort of like, oh, I haven't listened to that. I haven't heard that. Great. I'll go out and get it. That's not a kind of a list from 1 to 100 of the greatest albums of all time. But I'm always up for a list like that because it'll help me discover stuff. But you can't really do that with music or art, can you? What's the greatest painting of all time? It's really tough.
Yeah.
But I agree, you got to go some to beat Marley. And I agree, in terms of the story that he is telling. And the genius of Marley, and I guess of Chris Blackwell, was that he was able to take that story and that music and present it as rock music, and essentially market it as a rock band. And that enabled it to hit that broad white audience, as well as it was always embraced by an audience in the Southern Hemisphere.
Well, Mike, from Blur to the Beatles, it's been brilliant. Thank you so much for your time tonight. We really do appreciate that. And thank you. We're going to hang around like we usually do on a Saturday night, chatting to each other and listening to music together. So, but everyone, if you want to unmute, thank you so much, Mike. We really do appreciate your time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Great record you have back there.
Hey, this is the really crazy one. This is what happens when record companies get a hold of it.
Oh, wow.
You get
Aiden's going to be jealous.
Yeah, the sad thing is, the person that made this, he just called it the biscuit tin. And it's absolutely amazing. And you know what's in this.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yeah. I didn't actually realize there's a Loaded t-shirt in here. I may have to dig that out and wear it. Anyway,
eBay it.
It's like a cardboard box.
No, not eBay. Lovely to see you. Anytime you ever want to chat, just give us a shout.
Cheers, Mark.
Thanks, Mike.
Right, love.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Ah, what a great man.
That was wildly entertaining.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for